Good afternoon again, students. All right, so I was instructing you on how to create a PowerPoint presentation, and then I thought, what the heck? Let me show them one that I have created. And these are on my YouTube website, and there's one about the Cuban Revolution, part one, but obviously there was not a part two, and this is probably the part two. So go ahead, watch the Cuban Revolution part one, and that will give you ideas for your presentation because that presentation was done using Google Slides, which is the same as PowerPoint. It's just different, made by different companies. Slides is available online, while PowerPoint you can use whether you're online or you're offline. This too is a presentation on Google Slides that I did, which can give you ideas for yours. And you will see some of the very same questions that you're asked to answer being answered here. All right, so let's see. All right, so let's begin. And from the part one, you would have seen some of the same objectives that I'm going to ask you to do being covered as well. And it gives you ideas. All right, so let me put this on slideshow. And so click this for slideshow. So here goes. All right, so now I want to go to, this is a series of lessons, so that's why this is there. So you probably won't have this on yours. So we're going to lesson 6. All right, so the objectives for this particular lesson are to explain the causes for the Cuban Revolution, examine the consequences on the country and the wider Caribbean, examine the role of Fidel Castro as a liberator. All right, so here we go. Can you think of possible causes and effects of the revolution based on this video? So this will act as our lesson for today because, as you know, we meet once per week and the time is tight. So this you will be able to go back to as many times as you want.
In today's video, we're looking at the Cuban Revolution. There are 2 essential questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this video. The first, what was Cuba like prior to the Cuban Revolution of 1959? And the second, who was Fidel Castro and what did he do? Let's begin by looking at some background information on Cuba from the 1930s and the early 1950s. In September 1933, a man by the name of Fulgencio Batista took control of the government of Cuba through a military coup. He was extremely right-wing, almost if not entirely fascist, and he was supported by the USA from the outset. A few months after his coup, the USA recognized his new right-wing government. In 1937, Batista allowed the formation of rival political parties. However, he controlled the government completely until 1944. And what that meant was that although some other people were elected president at this time, Batista always used them sort of like a puppet to actually take over real control. In 1944, he was ousted and moved to Florida. However, in 1948, he moved back to Cuba and again took up a position in government. In 1951, he began to campaign to run for president in the election of 1952. Now we need to know that in Cuba in the 1950s, government corruption was rampant, and there was a new political candidate on the scene named Fidel Castro, who was running for Congress under an anti-corruption party platform. Castro was an interesting fellow. He graduated from the University of Havana in 1950 with a degree in law, and it was during his time in university that he became interested in politics. In 1952, Castro was also running for Congress. However, in March of 1952, before the election could occur, Batista seized power, ousted the president, Carlos Prioso Caras, in a bloodless coup, and basically took over. So, due to Batista's coup, there was no Cuban election in 1952, and this prompted Castro to begin planning a popular uprising in Cuba. Castro, as we will see, had 3 attempts at taking over and overthrowing the Cuban government and making a change in Cuba. His first attempt was on July 26, 1953. At this time, Castro led 120 men to storm a military barracks in order to steal weapons so that he could attempt his military revolution. The result was a major fail. Many rebels were killed. Castro himself went to jail with other rebels, and basically it was horrible. Once released, Castro ran away to Mexico because Batista was going to kill him. Then again, on November 26, 1953, about 3 years later, Castro returned, sailing to the east coast of Cuba with 81 men. However, the moment they got to the coast, government forces ambushed them and many were killed. In fact, there were only 18 survivors, and these 18 survivors included Castro, Che Guevara, and Castro's brother Raul Castro. They fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains in the south, where they stayed in hiding for 2 years, building their army, developing their political ideas, as well as their strategy. December 31st, 1958 is probably a big event to remember. Before we look at this, we need to learn a little bit more about Batista's regime. It was brutal. The rich people in Cuba did well if they rewarded Batista. There are mobsters and mafia all over the place, and Cuba basically became a playground for wealthy Americans with casinos and dancing. However, the regular Cubans were living in extreme poverty, and this made Cuban people increasingly dissatisfied with Batista's government. He was taxing them too much, they had nothing, and a lot of this money was going to the states and also into Batista's pockets. It was very corrupt, so the Cuban people were really unhappy. On December 31st, Batista lost the support of the Cuban army, and he gathered all of his friends together and left the country, going to Spain and Portugal, where he lived like a king because he had amassed a huge personal fortune. He actually died in exile in 1973. Everybody was happy that Batista had left, and Castro arrived in Havana a few days later. People loved Castro, and one of his first speeches to the Cuban public was full of powerful symbolism. This is a photo from that first speech. In it you can see a white dove sitting on his shoulder and a white dove sitting near to where he was speaking. According to Cuban beliefs, the white dove symbolized that Castro was going to deliver Cuba from all of the bad things that had happened to it in its past, and lead it towards a very bright and strong future. So Cubans were extremely happy. However, America was not so happy that they had just lost an ally that they had used to have, and now there was a seemingly communist government within about 160 kilometers from the American border. And we will see in our next videos how the Cuban Revolution led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thanks for watching.
All right, so you will see here that Cuba, the things that would have caused the Cuban Revolution. And I will say to you too that as a result of that, people weren't happy. And you notice the connection between among all the revolutions. Poor people dissatisfied, people not getting what they're supposed to get, so they feel they have to get up and fight for it. Rich people getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So Batista was basically working with the US, milking the people, making the profits for himself and giving it to the US, and the people were suffering. And here came Castro and his allies to fight for the freedom of Cuba. Let's continue. Now, based on that, that should have given you some idea as to what would have happened in terms of why the revolution took place. Now, here's another video, and this one is talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion.
In today's video, we're looking at the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, in a report by the CIA after the invasion occurred, was called the perfect failure. So by the end of this video, there are 3 questions you should be able to answer. The first, what is a sphere of influence? The second, how did the Americans plan to get rid of Castro, and why did they believe that this plan would work? And the third, what were the results of the Bay of Pigs failure? So before we start looking directly at the Bay of Pigs invasion, let's have a little review from our last video. In 1958, Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, who was dictator of Cuba, in a 3-year guerrilla campaign, and Fidel Castro became the leader of Cuba. So Cuba became a seemingly communist state within the American sphere of influence. Here's a map of the spheres of influence. And basically on this map, what you can see is that anything that's blue was in the American sphere of influence, and anything in red was in the Soviet sphere of influence. and a sphere of influence is any area in which one country, for example the USA or Russia, had a lot of power over another country or countries. So you can see the Americans have power over all the countries in blue, and the Soviets have, in their sphere of influence, power or a connection with all the countries that are in red. So that is what a sphere of influence is. So basically, the Americans are very afraid because now there seems to be a communist government in their sphere of influence, very close to their country. So, from 1959 to 1961, there was a frosty relationship between the USA and Cuba, but there was no direct confrontation. We need to know that the upper and middle class Cubans were starting to migrate to the USA, particularly to Miami, because it's very close to Cuba, and you can still find a lot of Cuban migrants living in Miami today. These Cubans were migrating because Castro had begun taking over U.S. private property and U.S.-owned businesses. So anyone with a connection to the U.S. or the Batista regime would want to get out of the country. However, the USA was able to maintain its naval base in Guantanamo Bay, which is in the far south of Cuba. Castro said that Americans living in Cuba were safe and that he just wanted to run Cuba without interference. But people were getting worried because as Castro took over these businesses, people were beginning to think that Castro was a communist. In the summer of 1960, reports are heard that Cuba is receiving arms from the USSR and that U.S. spies know about this. However, it was not until 1961 that we see any action about trying to get rid of Castro. So the U.S. believed that Castro was not a popular leader, and they believed this because it was the upper and middle class Cuban migrants who didn't like Castro who were telling them this. These migrants told the U.S. that Castro was not popular, and that if there was an American-backed invasion, the Cuban people would support it. So, in March of 1960, Eisenhower directed the CIA to develop a plan for the invasion of Cuba and the overthrow of Castro. He called this brigade of people Brigade 2506. President Kennedy was elected in November of 1960, and soon after he took office in 61, he gave consent to this plan. So there was a plan to have the CIA-backed revolution to overthrow Castro and replace him with a capitalist government sympathetic to the USA. The US wanted to make it seem as if the Americans were not backing the revolution. They want to make it seem like the revolution was actually developed by the Cuban migrants themselves. So the USA supplied arms, trained, equipped, and transported 1,400 anti-Castro exiles, those upper and middle-class Cubans who had moved to Miami, to Guatemala. And they invaded Cuba on April 17, 1961, at the Bay of Pigs, which is just south of Havana. So what happened? Basically, Castro knew about the invasion. Perhaps some of the exiles weren't as tight-lipped as they should have been. Perhaps Castro's spies were really great. But whatever it was, he knew about the invasion. And so Brigade 2506 was met by 20,000 Cuban troops who were armed with tanks and modern weapons. In all, about 1,000 were captured and held for 1.5 years, and the rest were killed. All of Brigade 2506 were either captured or killed within 2 days. This led to a few things. First of all, it was a huge failure for the USA because it seemed to everybody that this was a US-backed plan. It strengthened Castro's position in Cuba. He was seen as the savior, as someone who could protect Cuba. Third, it strengthened the idea of communism in Cuba, so Cubans themselves began to more fully support the idea of communism. Fourth, it suggested to the USSR that Kennedy was a weak president. Remember that this is happening in 1961, at approximately the same time as the Berlin Wall crisis. And fourth, it leads Castro and Khrushchev to become very suspicious of the USA and afraid of another US invasion. So Castro begins to ask the USSR for help and weapons which would eventually come about, and we will see the effects of this in our next video. So that's the Bay of Pigs invasion. As you can see, it was the perfect failure. However, in 1963, There's a quote by John F. Kennedy. He said, "I believe there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the U.S. Now, we shall have to pay for those sins." So basically, Kennedy was saying, in hindsight, he thought that the U.S. backing of Batista led to the strength of communism in Cuba, and this, in turn, led to all these problems that the U.S. was facing in Cuba during the 1960s. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Alright, so there you go again. And you will see this occurring over a number of different revolutions that you see taking place in the Caribbean. So we had the Haitian one. The US played a little part, but not great. Now you see in the Cuban Revolution, and the US is playing a major part. And we're going to see the Grenadian Revolution, and yes, the US again is a big part of that. And we are going to continue to see the revolutions, and we're going to see the Moran Bay Rebellion. And then it causes you to wonder, what is it, or what role was the US really playing back then? And is it in a bid for to be the superpower, or is it that they felt threatened, or was it world domination? What was it? Was it just misguided decisions or attempts? However, we continue to see what happened in the Cuban Revolution. So those are some of the causes for the Cuban Revolution as we know it. Sorry about that. Alright, so we will continue. Now, we want to discuss the causes and the effects. So we would have seen the causes, and we start to see the effects, right? We start to see the causes of the revolution. The people were poor. Batista was treating them badly. Then the US tried to invade, and we continue. The Cuban Revolution started. So now we're talking about where Cuba is located. It's 90 miles south of Florida, and because of this, of course, as you would have heard before, that posed a threat for the US, because they're like, these people are just too close to us to not be with us. And trust me, they say keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. In this case, the US wanted their enemies to be far away, very far away, not at their back door where they didn't know what they were doing. And Cuba is so close. Now, some changes that Cuba had experienced was that there was a Spanish war, just like in the Haitian Revolution. There were issues happening in France, so there were issues happening in Spain as well. And these changes in Spain caused Cuba and Cubans to feel very uncomfortable in how things were going on. So the US declared war on Spain to help people gain freedom from Spanish rule. They claimed to be helping Cuba to be free from Spanish rule. But then when the Cubans really looked at it and looked at what the US was presenting to them as the agreement, the Cubans realized, so it's kind of like, I don't remember how we say it in Jamaica, swap, something like that for monkey or something. But anyway, forget that. So they were saying, so okay, so it's like giving up Spain having us as a colony to become a colony of the US? No, we don't think so. So Cuba started thinking, okay, so the US helped Cuba to be free of Spain, and expected Cuba to now be forever loyal to them and to become like a US colony. And Cuba thought, oh no, we just came out of a very bad relationship as a colony of Spain. We are not about to become the colony of anybody else. So when Batista started with his type of government where the people were suffering and he was being backed by the US, the people were starting to become agitated. So the US start their own new government system in Cuba. Them set up Guantanamo Bay where they have soldiers and whatever stationed there. And for the next years, Cuba had a series of rulers. Persons were elected, persons took over as dictators. It wasn't pretty. And here we have a background of Batista. He was very rich, while And the country was rich, but most people were poor. And the Cubans were, as I said, continuously angry. Now, the US liked Batista because he allowed US businesses to come and take over Cuba, and even the mobs and stuff that existed in Cuba, in America, they could come and set up big businesses in Cuba and benefit from it. And the Americans owned a whole heap of land in Cuba. It's as if it was mini America. And because of that, America loved him because they were benefiting from the relationship. But the Cubans hated Batista because to them, Batista was a dictator, and common things like education and healthcare were not good in Cuba, and the people were not benefiting. So, question, who was Fulgencio Batista? Who liked him and who didn't like him? Who disliked Batista and why didn't they like him? Then you had Castro coming up in the late 50s, a lawyer, young, brilliant, and a rebel, as it turns out to be, who took over after Batista left. And this is a little background of Fidel that you can look at. You can pause the video to look at it and to read it and to become familiar with it. And communism really refers to a system of government where there's dictatorship, and it's a communal living, a community living where everybody who is rich is rich, everybody is poor is poor. It's kind of a system where no matter what job you worked, you earn the same money, you were afforded the same portions for food, you weren't as free to do as you please in Jamaica, where we have a democracy. You can vote for your leader, you can work as a doctor and earn a certain money, or you can work as a pilot and earn a certain amount of money. No, it don't matter what job you worked in Cuba, you all lived at the same communal, same level. So that was what communism was about. And America was very much against communism, and Russia was pioneer of communism at the time. So Cuba being so close to the US, now joining up with Russia for communism, and US and Russia were big enemies, was a problem for the US, of course. So as you would have heard before, Castro took the American property, took over the businesses, and was returning these to the Cuban people. So the Cuban government was now managing these on behalf of the Cuban people. And we go through and we see the things that came out that were good. Education was better to the point where Cuba had one of the best education systems in the world. Healthcare was better. However, the communists, they were of, especially in Cuba, they were of Catholic persuasion, and so you were not so free to worship as you please. You were required to worship the national religion, which would have been Catholicism, and people had very low income, and your lives were really controlled by the government. You didn't control your own life. And so the relationship between Cuba and the US became tense, and it wasn't a nice one, and they were continuously at odds with each other. And you can do your further research to answer these questions as to why the US didn't like Cuba, and why the Soviet Union liked Cuba, and what the Soviet Union, same as Russia, did for Cuba. So there was almost a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the US. So the Soviet Union having Cuba now on their side, right in the US backdoor, proves advantage for Cuba, for Soviet and against the US. And these are other things that are happening. So there was an embargo on Cuba. The US now start to block anything Cuban. Cubans, Americans couldn't travel to Cuba. Americans were not allowed to do business with Cubans or in Cuba. And even now, some of those restrictions still apply. Under the regime of President Obama, he was trying to relinquish to fix some of these. But then under President Trump, some of those things were replaced. And as such, Cuba and the US, even though the relationship is a little bit better, is still tense. So here you go again, a summary of the causes of the Cuban Revolution. And again, you pause the video to make notes or to read. And we also see the effects of the revolution outlined on Cuba. So we can see the results of the revolution. Now, let me tell you something as I see this. You see the Garvey Massey High School in Clarendon underlined? Well, that's my high school. That's my alma mater. That's where I went to high school. And our nickname is Cubans. So if you see our school bus in Maypen or wherever you're going to see, say Cubans. That's our nickname. We call ourselves Cubans. All right. So the thing is, Cuba developed some friendly relationship with other countries in the region, especially like Jamaica. And back in the day, Norman Manley was even accused of wanting to turning Jamaica into a communist country as well. So Jamaica and Cuba has always been tight. Cuba has, even now you see Cuba sending nurses to work in Jamaica, especially when we have crisis and you have the Cuban nurses working here. And they have supported our health program. You have persons going to Cuba to get their eye surgeries done free of cost. And then you have persons taking up scholarships to study in Cuba. And Cuba, as a part of an agreement of a show of friendship with Jamaica, they donated 3 institutions to Jamaica. One, the G.C. Foster College, the Jose Marti High School, and the Garvey Massey High School. So Jose Marti was named after a Cuban hero. G.C. Foster was named after an outstanding Jamaican. And Garvey Massey now was named as a combination of a Cuban hero or outstanding Cuban and a Jamaican hero. So one school, 3 schools were given as gift. One school named fully Cuban, one school fully named fully Jamaican, and one school has a combination of a Cuban and Jamaican name, and that is, of course, the Garvey Massey High School right here in Clarendon. So big up my Cubans. All right, so yes, Garvey Massey High School, and we are proud of our heritage. All 3 schools are built similarly, and except for now where expansions would have taken place, and Garvey Massey is right beside the air base, the Vernon Field Air Base. So all that is another story, and trust me, you can read up to it and you will see all of things that were happening in those revolutionary times and stuff, and possibility of things that could happen, but that's a different lesson. And so we saw inscriptions that were from original paintings that were in Spanish. While we were at school, we had, I remember, the male dorm father, dorm master. He fought in World War II and he spoke Spanish. We had many members of staff, especially like the janitors, etc., who would have visited Cuba or who would have been to work in Cuba. And so they had a Cuban connection and they too spoke Spanish. So I remember some persons like Mr. Grant, he was one of our janitors. And I remember Miss Lopez, I don't remember if she went to Cuba, but she had some Cuban ancestry as well. And so on. So we had a good relationship through those systems there. All right, much about that. Let's continue. So, as I had mentioned, too, in passing, there was a block between the US and Cuba. And US, of course, was also forcing other persons in the region not to do business with Cuba, not to have a good relationship with Cuba, because they felt that if they did, then Cuba could influence them to become communists and become enemies of the US. But of course, Jamaica, being the Jamaica that we are, or that we were then, of course, did what Jamaica wanted to do, and Jamaica saw Cuba as a neighbor and a good neighbor, and Jamaica continued to do business and has continued to do business with Cuba. So there's also a video called Fidel Castro, Liberator or Dictator. You watch that and you decide, do you think he's a liberator, he freed the Cuban people, or do you think he's a dictator where he became do as I say and not as I do, and bossy over Cuba? What are your opinions? And here's the video as well. I don't know if we will have time to watch this. We will probably have to pick up the rest of this lesson at another time.
Hailed as a legend and hero by supporters, but denounced as a dictator by critics, he's left a legacy not to be forgotten. November 25th marks 3 years since Fidel Castro's death, the man who governed Cuba for nearly half a century. That legacy includes his role in the Cuban Revolution,
the overthrow of the Washington-backed Batista regime, and the creation of a communist nation at the doorsteps of the United States, defying subsequent attempts to overthrow him. Born in 1926 to a prosperous sugarcane farmer, much of Castro's schooling was at Catholic institutions. In 1945, he started law school at the University of Havana, where he participated in student politics. Turning his back on a life of privilege, Fidel went on to become a revolutionary figure. He joined a failed attempt to overthrow General Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic in 1947, and then took part in urban riots in the Colombian capital. He started practicing law after graduation. At the time, General Fulgencio Batista ran for a second term as Cuba's president. Falling behind in the polls, Batista staged a military coup in 1952 and canceled the elections, with the U.S. recognizing his government. After legal means failed to end the dictatorship, Castro led a rebel force that ousted Batista in 1959, and 2 years later, he created the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere, assuming the role of premier until 1976 when he became president. Under Castro's leadership, American-owned businesses were brought under state control, and Cubans were given free healthcare and education, which saw the standard of living improve for many people through the 1980s. But that standard of living was not able to sustain itself throughout his leadership. Castro also clamped down heavily on dissent, jailing anti-government forces, and caused hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee to the United States. After he took power, U.S. State Department and CIA officials launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, leaning on the 1,400 U.S.-trained Cubans who fled after Castro took power. But the invasion ended in defeat less than 24 hours later and led to heightened tensions between Havana and Washington. Castro then signed a defense pact in 1962 with the former USSR, allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed in Cuba. President Kennedy then imposed a naval blockade, and the situation spiraled into the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which nearly sparked nuclear war. The U.S. then placed tight sanctions on Havana, prompting Moscow to remove its weapons. The Soviet Union continued its economic support for Cuba until its collapse in 1991, after which Cuba faced a dire economic state through the 1990s. 34,000 Cubans tried to flee to the U.S. in 1994, but many of them drowned on the way there. The early 2000s saw Cuba re-emerge as a regional influencer as leftist governments won power in Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay. Poor health eventually forced Fidel Castro to hand provisional power to his brother Raúl in 2006. He then formally relinquished his role in 2008. On August 13, 2016, he made his last public appearance on his 90th birthday, telling congressional delegates that he did not have long to live. He passed away 3 months later. Castro's legacy continued on late into his career and even after his death. A force to be reckoned with, Castro stayed in power alongside 10 U.S. presidents from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. According to History.com, Castro survived an estimated 638 CIA attempts on his life during his tenure. When his brother Raúl stepped down last year, the National Assembly replaced him with his vice president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. Last month, Russian President Putin invited him to Moscow, praising his resilience in the face of U.S. pressure. As Cuba's government moves forward with politics as usual, how do you think history will judge Fidel Castro? As a rebel or a revolutionary?
All right, and quite a beautiful way to end this section of the lesson. So I suppose there will be a part 3. And so history is beautiful, right? And so, as I said, there will be a part 3, and you will use this to just educate yourself and to motivate you to go and do further research, to be able to be abreast with what's happening in our region, what has happened, and how this may affect our future.